Hello, friends of Herbie, and welcome to this new episode of the Campfire Talks with Herbie. As you mostly know, this is a talk show with prominent professionals in this industry of knowledge work, and we want to find out how we can improve this industry by looking at various methods and approaches. And today, as always, I have a guest. The guest is Venkatesh Krishnamurthy. I hope I pronounced that right, but I know we can also call him Venky. Welcome, Venky.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for the wonderful intro. And yeah, you did pronounce it very well. It's a complex name. And thanks for inviting me to the show. I'm really looking forward for the chat.
It's a great pleasure, and I would just anticipate to the audience that you are an expert on LeSS, the large-scale Scrum. So I'm sure we'll have a very interesting conversation today. But as usual, let's get to know who you are. Who are you, Venky?
Who am I? I think I have two answers to it, Steve. One is that the philosophical answer. I have my heater running. It's very cold here, so let me switch it off. The philosophical answer and possibly the answer that is useful to everyone. The philosophical answer is that in the younger days, I used to believe in the rebirth and the life and the karma and all those things. But over a period of several years, it has taken different, gone through a lot of transformation in my thought process, and especially with trying to learn more about how the systems work and how the complex systems work and systems thinking, the applicability of systems thinking, so on and so forth. Even though these concepts looks, something that we can use it for management and industries in solving problems, but these ideas actually gave me a lot of philosophical, has embedded a lot of philosophical ideas, and nowadays I believe that possibly it's just a flesh and blood. There is a brain, and we are just evolved entities, better than other species. We are able to think and we are able to make decisions. As such, we are just meaning-making machines. We just give some meaning to it, and then we dance around. In Australia, we say that we do a kumbaya around a lot of things, and we give it to it, and that's how I look at it. So I'm part of, just another human being on Earth. That's more of a philosophical answer. But more useful answer for the people could be that I am an agile coach at the moment in my life. I come from a software background. I used to be a computer science and engineer, computer science and engineering graduate, studied in India. Then I spent several years working in US as a programmer. And also I spent some years in France, again, working on, companies like Peugeot, Citroën, and IBM, before relocating to India. And then nearly 10 years ago, I moved to Australia, and I have been doing a lot of work in the agile and the coaching industry, helping organizations with their agile journey or anything related to the delivery, anything related to the transformation, whatever helps the organization. That's what I'm currently doing. And yeah, I have a wonderful wife and a great son who's 10 years old.
Which I know you just put to bed moments ago. Otherwise, they would have invited him to join you live on the broadcast. But tell me, how did you get involved with this agile organizational performance? And you are obviously making a living in this sector.
Yeah, true. See, it all started more like an accident. As I told you earlier, that I used to work in US. So I used to work for a startup company in Boston, and one day I was a Java programmer, and one day my boss came and said that there is something called extreme programming. This is in 2001 when Agile Manifesto had just created. And extreme programming was the most popular one in that year. So he said that, oh, we're going to do something called daily stand-up, and we are going to use a tool called JUnit to write our unit tests. That was the first time I heard about Agile extreme programming. But apart from the unit testing using JUnit and the stand-up, we didn't do anything. But we did quite rigorously all those things because my boss believed in it, and he really wanted all our team members to practice it. Fast forward, in 2003, I used to work for a company called Valtech in India, and Greg Lorman, who is one of the co-inventors of a large-scale Scrum, which is also called as LeSS. He was the coach in the organization, and he was the one who introduced me to Scrum. And I did his certification at the time. He was certified Scrum trainer, and I did attend his certified Scrum Master training, and voila, I became a Scrum Master. But the good news was that he was doing a lot of experiments at that point of time. Just to give you some idea how this is connected to LeSS, large-scale Scrum is about applying Scrum on multiple teams. Scrum is designed only for single team. When a lot of companies started applying Scrum on multiple teams, they started having issues around how many product owners do we need? Do we need to have product owners? Do we need to have Scrum Masters? Do we need to have one Scrum Master? Do we want to have multiple Scrum Masters? There was a whole lot of things happening, and there was no answer to it from the Scrum community at that time, and everyone was grappling. So the approach that at that time Craig took was, why can't we do an experiment? Bring a lot of ideas from lean thinking, systems thinking, theory of constraints, so on and so forth into the table, and then see how can we roll out applying Scrum kind of a concept on multiple teams and do the product development. That was
so
his idea.
less developed like in an experimental manner. It was not like an act of design, but it was evolved through experiments, right?
Exactly. So Craig and Bass together, they did more than 550 experiments over a period of 10 years. And they captured all these things in several books, saying that, hey, you know what, they're all the experiments. Whenever you're scaling Scrum, you need to be aware that these ideas work and these ideas don't work. That was their intent. And I was just lucky enough that I was there with Craig at, during those experiments, and with several hundred experiments, I was getting involved as a Scrum Master and as a developer as well. But of course, no one knew at the time that after several years, these ideas of nearly 500 experiments will be converted into a framework, and I will become a LeSS trainer and all those things. But it's all, that's the reason why I was saying I was just lucky enough that I was there at that time, and I got deeply involved, and I was really passionate about it. I did a lot of coaching and training with for several clients with Craig.
So you saw LeSS as it was being developed, like as it was growing, like from infancy to adolescence and adulthood, something like that.
Exactly. I have seen LeSS from its infancy, how it was created and what kind of experiments we did, right from the whiteboard pictures that we used to draw, and the ideas that was experimented actually in front of me. I saw how things actually worked and how organizations transformed. That's where I became so convinced about Agile and Scrum that wonderful place, wonderful process, and this is something that I need to do. And that's how it all started.
I've already shown here your LinkedIn address, but we'll just present it like formally here in the sense that if people want to reach out to you, they can get you on linkedin.com/in/systems thinker. What a wonderful short name you got there on LinkedIn. That's I really like that one. And they can also catch you on Twitter with @Venky_NK. And you also have this site, which also has a marvelous name, empirical.coach. You're really good at finding good names. That's I like all of them. Okay, so you know that I'm the creator of TameFlow. How did you come across TameFlow, and would you ever use it like professionally?
Yes, I think a couple of years ago, I was doing some research, something either around theory of constraints of Kahneman. I don't remember. That's how I came across the TameFlow. I studied a little bit just to get some ideas of what TameFlow is all about. But that's my brief brush with TameFlow. I'm not an expert. That's where I'm really willing to learn all the effort that you have put in creating TameFlow, and I'm always open to learn from every source. There's always place to learn. So I could see how I can leverage in helping a lot of our customers. And also I see that already, LeSS is a framework. The beauty of any framework approach is that you can mix and match with various ideas. People have mixed and matched, Scrum with Kanban, Scrum with XP. Possibly, I'm sure that someone would have already experimented Scrum with TameFlow. So anything that you can do with Scrum, you can do with LeSS as well.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic from that point of view, because TameFlow, maybe we'll get into the details later, but I will just reflect a moment on what you just said. TameFlow is not a framework, but it's based on patterns and mental models. So it's extremely fluid, flexible, plastic. You can adapt TameFlow to most situations. And since Venky, since you are from India, and I know you have some excellent food there. Now, one metaphor that I use is that TameFlow is like some good spices. Now you can sprinkle spices on top of any dish, and that dish will become just so much better. So I'm sure that the combination TameFlow and LeSS will be something very, very interesting, which we should explore. But enough with this professionalism. Who are you in real life? Now tell us something about yourself. What is a typical day, and what makes you happy at the end of the day?
My my typical day seems to be changing quite drastically with COVID situation around. Especially in Melbourne, we have been under lockdown since February, March. So we can't drive around, and I'm working from home as well since last several months. So the typical day right now has changed, but I will explain, keeping my COVID context in mind. Around. I typically get up around 6:37, and I have learned from my wife that she drinks something called alkatizers. It's basically a mixture of all green smoothies. We have kale, you have some cinnamon powder, you have celery. I add bitter melon, which is really, really bitter, maybe a little bit of apple, and I make a smoothie. The first thing in the morning is to drink a glass of water, and then generally I prepare smoothie the night before and I keep it in the refrigerator. So I drink that smoothie, and then I give around 15-20 minutes. Then I jump into my coffee. So I'm a big coffee drinker. I have experimented with various coffee machines, Nespresso, so on and so forth. But finally, I found, I think, my dream coffee machine, which is called AeroPress. It's a wonderful thing. Of course, it's pretty economical as well. You can never fail to make a perfect coffee with that. But of course, you don't
Now
have a good.
this sounds really interesting. Now, what was the name of that machine?
It's called AeroPress, AeroPress.
Aeropress. Okay, never heard about that.
Yeah, it is. It's actually not a machine. It's just a two um, plastic pistons kind of a thing. It's just a mechanical thing. You just
Uh-huh.
pour the coffee powder. It has a small filter which you put a small coffee filter on it, and you just press it using the pressure. Based on the gravity, you know how it works is that pressure that you put and the gravitational force creates this perfect coffee for you. So that's my that's my recent passion for coffee.
Yeah, I
After
have to explore that.
No, I definitely have to give it a try. That yeah, that is by 7:30, I am pretty much with the coffee ready and the smoothie ready. If I'm still hungry, I will have some wheat bix or oats kind of a thing. Otherwise, I'll jump into checking my emails. Nowadays, sometimes I do a lot of training and coaching during the weekends. So sometimes I get a chance to prepare sometime in the morning. Around 9:30, I will log on to my work, and then till 5 o'clock, I have in a back-to-back meeting. After five, take a few minutes break, then go for a long walk. That's the only thing right now it is allowed here. Before 8 o'clock, you need to be back home. Otherwise, the curfew starts here because of the COVID. So I need to do my take care of my health and other things. Ensure that I have 10,000 steps, or at least walk 6 to 7 kilometers a day. I do that. Then spend some time with the family. We watch family movies together. Because of the COVID again, we select a theme of movies every weekend. In the last weekend, we took the theme of the Wolverine, X-Men kind of a thing. And Avengers was one of the theme in another weekend. So we watch a lot of movies during the weekend. That's the only thing. Otherwise, we can't socialize with people.
Yeah, that's the current situation. And in this long career, it's like 18 years. What are some peculiar skills or insights that you have developed, and what are some challenges that you have seen and that you still see in the future?
Great question, Steve. Um, it's difficult to summarize in few words or few things. There could be a lot of things, but I will try to summarize as much as I can that is impactful from my life's perspective. See, I used to be very, very passionate, and when you become very passionate about Agile and Scrum, you start only looking at Agile and Scrum or whatever the technology that you know of, and you start going and um, preaching the same thing to the customers and to everyone. It's like the saying goes: when you have a hammer, you start seeing everything as a nail. But over a period of time, I would say that I'm lucky that I met several fantastic experienced thought leaders, Fred, Baswoda, and several others. And I learned quite a bit from them. Um, what I feel is that no matter what, how much we think we know, we need to be humble. There is always someone um, who knows better than you, and there is always opportunity to learn. So the best way is that um, saying that I'm an expert in one thing basically stops us from growing and learning. Even now, I have several. I tend to meet several of these thought leaders around. I tend to surround myself with people who are much more intelligent than me, and then I learn from them every day. It's wonderful to see that how much we don't know in life, and that's one thing. Second thing is 99% of the things that we see in the world is a noise, lot of noise out there. Only someone who is learned, who has that ability and inclination, will be able to separate the noise from the real knowledge. But that's very, very less, and you need to ensure that you tend to build that capability to differentiate what is noise and from what is the real thing there. It's extremely easy in the internet era to create followers on Twitters, to create followers on Instagram, to create followers on Facebook or on LinkedIn. But number of followers is not a reflection of what you know, what you don't know. There are extremely smart, intelligent people that I've come across who have pretty much no followers on LinkedIn or no followers on Twitter, but they keep posting wonderful, wonderful content there. We need to recognize such people.
Yeah, now you mentioned like the social media and the social aspect, and TameFlow actually has a community, and I invite you to join the community and to bring your experience and wisdom to the folks there. It is a community of peers and of enthusiasts. And for the audience here, I'm just showing here in the banner below the address. It's https://community.tameflow.com. What do you think is the value of such a community, and what would you like to find in such a community of peers?
I always scout for the knowledge. I look for what I don't know, and is there something that I can learn from the community? That's always that I I'm part of several Slack groups, and it's wonderful to see that they have several channels. People keep posting articles, interesting ideas, and the books, and so on and so forth. That is the beauty of the community. That's what I always look for whenever I join any community. What can I learn from them? And of course, I'm always there to answer any questions, but I always end up, I believe in wisdom of crowd, that wisdom of crowd is much, much better than an individual thing. There is always scope for learning.
Yeah, you mentioned the crowds, and in effect, we have Jitesh Dinashandra, hello from London, who joined us on the YouTube chat. So this is exactly like an instance of a network bringing together people that are far apart but share an interest. So this industry is of course going forward. What do you see coming in the future, and could you possibly maybe even frame the role of TameFlow from what you know about TameFlow in this evolution of the industry?
See, how I see the industry is that there is no rationality. We can't really rationally predict what comes in, what comes out, what's the next trend there. And I personally believe that nowadays a lot of things are driven by certifications. And when you look at the job profile, people will look for, are you certified in certain things? Are you certified in in a particular framework or a gaming idea? The job market is driven by the certifications. So keeping that kind of a trend in mind, anything that helps the individuals to put the bread on the table is what people actually pick up, and that's what drives the market. The market is actually not necessarily driven by what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong for the industry. It's the people at the ground who apply for jobs, the recruiting companies, and the actual companies who are recruiting. Well, these are the people who drive the market, Steve. So it's extremely difficult. And nowadays, people get fed up with one framework, and tomorrow, when they see another framework with with some new ideas, they will latch onto it until they get bored with it. then they will jump onto another framework. That the market keeps changing. Possibly, we could consider that this is an experimentation, but at the end of the day, applying the shuhari kind of a idea, I personally believe that the ideas, frameworks, process, methodologies, they are wonderfully helpful for organizations in the beginning. But at some point of time, the organization needs to look at various ideas, and then they should need to create something that works for them. So they need to be open for learning from every industry, every framework, whether it is safe, whether it is less, whether it's a TameFlow. People use DAD. There are literally hundreds of them, Kanban and Scrum. There's no doubt for it. You need to be open for learning, but the organization needs to make decisions and create something that works for them in the longer run. In the shorter run, all these frameworks and ideas really, really helpful for them. But how it is driven, what is picked up, it's all decided by the job market. That's how I'm seeing the industry.
Yeah, it has to have a utility aspect. It must deliver, and it must provide a living for the practitioners in the industry, and that I think is very, very important. And I like your like openness of having like the learning mindset that you can always learn from one another and from different schools of thought. So at this point, I'm curious now. Is there anything in particular you are wondering about TameFlow and what is TameFlow or any details on, or considerations with respect to LeSS?
Yeah, of course, there are several questions I have. In fact, the first thing that really caught my attention with the TameFlow is the house with four pillars: the operational, financial, the information, and psychological. When I saw that, it reminded me of the pillars of lean, or some people call it as house of lean. I'm just curious to know, was there something that influenced your thought from the house of lean, or is there anything that are related to each other, or is it something that you came up with um, on your own idea? Because many of the ideas around flow and all these things are related to some way to lean thinking. That's where I was just curious to understand the connectedness between the house of lean picture and the picture that you have created under TameFlow.
Oh, a very interesting question there. I must like stress what I hinted at before, that TameFlow is really based on patterns thinking. That is the origin of TameFlow, and it goes back to the mid 90s. And I have been working primarily on organizational design patterns. So that's where TameFlow started, and some of those patterns have deep consequences on how you look, observe, and understand what is going on inside the organizations. Eventually, that led me to focus on the notion of flow. Actually, the first dimension I looked into was psychological flow, because that was more related to the pattern approach that is looking at the companies as social bodies of individuals that communicate and interact and make decisions together while they are tending towards a common goal. And there they might have diversity of opinion, they might have conflicts, so you need to resolve those conflicts. That's where TameFlow like came from. But then looking at flow, I was exposed to the theory of constraints before I knew anything about lean. So my entry into the the world of, let's say, operational flow was via TOC. As a matter of fact, the first book that David Anderson wrote, Software Engineering Management, I think it was called, and it was about applying theory of constraints to software engineering. And then David Anderson came up with this idea of the Kanban method, which, as you very well know, has almost nothing to do with the real Kanban of Taiichi Ohno. But through that terminology, I did discover lean, and I saw the four pillars. I think it's mostly coincidental that some of those pillars are like overlapping the four flows, but I think it's also funny that the pillars are like vertical. I see the flows as horizontal, so maybe they are orthogonal in more than one way. There is a lot to learn from Taiichi Ohno and the whole like philosophical aspect of Toyota, which maybe has gone lost a bit in the modern reinterpretation of lean systems thinking. But I remember the first time I saw you talking was a few weeks ago with that interview on LinkedIn, where you explained a lot about the value of working with the mindset of the people first, and then looking at the improvement of the systems. And I think that resonates a lot with the approach I had, where the focus was first on the psychological elements, and then from there derive what are the other flows. So the flow of information, the flow of operation, and of course, what every business cares about, the flow of money, the flow of finance. TOC has had a very important role in all of this, and as a matter of fact, TameFlow is what it is today because when David Anderson invented the Kanban method, one motive behind that was that it was next to impossible to find the constraint in knowledge work. But that abandoning TOC in favor of the Kanban method was really disturbing for me, because one of the founding patterns I work with is the pattern of unity of purpose and theory of constraints, with the notion of finding one single point in the whole organization that affects everything else, gives you a focal point where people can focus on and gather together. So it is like a catalyst to create unity of purpose. Now the Kanban method was throwing this away, so I did not like that development at all, because I saw that one of the most powerful practical things, operational things that could help in creating the unity of purpose was being discarded. So that's where I set out, because just applying the logic of Goldratt, that logically there must be a constraint, otherwise your capability, your production capability would be infinite. So logically there must be a constraint, and from there I set out to resolve this conundrum. Now, how do you find the constraint in knowledge work where everything is moving and changing all the time, and it seems like it's never going to be possible at all? So
sorry to interrupt, Steve. This this is very powerful. I think one of the from the lean perspective, one of the idea is the concept of perfection vision. They're saying that the constraint. You need to create a constraint such that it should lead to Kaizen, or the continuous improvement. And I'm seeing a lot of the resemblance to the unity of purpose aspect, from TameFlow that you're talking.
Yeah, I think that's the notion of I wrote about this ages ago, but you can refer to the world of arts, the friction of the medium. If you take a sculpture who has to carve stone, the stone is very, very hard, so it's offering resistance. But it is in that resistance that the shaping and the forming of the artwork comes about. And when you're talking about Kaizen, I see that in a similar way, that you're looking at what is the resistance of the medium. In this case, the medium is the work that the organization is trying to perform. So you're trying to figure out now where is the resistance there, and how can we shape that resistance so that the work flows better through the system. And TOC is entirely consistent with that. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Goldratt's paper, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, where he recognizes that there is a continuum between past giants like Henry Ford and Taichi Ono and himself who came afterwards. And I think that's a heritage that all of us have to pick up. There is no school of thought that is better or worse than another. It's just a continuous evolution. And I'm sure that in 50 years' time, Lean and TameFlow will have been superseded by something else. But that's how it should be. So I see this as an ecology of ideas. And what you said moments ago, it's at the end, it's the market, it's the reality that decides which ideas are better fit for the situation, for the individuals, for the companies.
True. And also something that from the complexity perspective that I learned is that even though in the short-term perspective the market can decide what is relevant at the moment, but the ideas that will stay for a longer period of time are the ones which have been tried, tested, and eternal. So the ideas and the principles and the values might remain the same. The practices will keep changing, and the ideas keep coming. That's something that I learned. That even though we talk about systems thinking, complexity science, and the lean thinking, these ideas are pretty at the I would say that metadata level, not at the practice level. These are the thinkings that have been staying for a long time. The practices keeps changing because the markets is very good at picking up the practices. They really want a tool, they want a framework, they want a graphical image. When you go to an organization as a consultant, they say that don't tell me all about thinking, don't tell me all about these values and principles. Tell me what should I do to ensure that the delivery happens on time, on budget. This is so basically they want something concrete practice at the moment. Somewhere I was discussing that nowadays the CEOs get maximum 2 years to turn around a company, and the mindset change, thinking change, cultural change, all these things, takes years and years of continuous practice in an organization. They don't have enough time to turn it around. So the CEO only looks at the moment, I have 2 years of time. How can I improve my stock price? How can I improve my return on investment? So the short-term thinking drives many of the practices and the decisions in the market at the moment. But in the long run, I believe that the ideas and the thinkings and the principles that will stay for a longer period of time.
Well, that's very thoughtful. By the way, I see we have another greeting here from Anil Jain from Indore in India. Welcome to the show. Yes, I think that's a very relevant point of the tension between the short term and the long term. And here I think that Goldratt's thinking is very relevant. He was very practical, and he said, no, purpose of a company, the goal of a company. I won't go into the purpose, that's another thing. But the goal of a company is to make more money today and in the future. And people sort of react in a knee-jerking way when they hear that statement, because it seems that it is very, very superficial, and it's just looking at the immediate profit maximization. But the key point there is that second part of the sentence, and in the future, which implies a whole dimension of sustainability that typically you do not find in the approaches that are being sold for the short term, for the purpose of delivering the most bang for the buck by the next quarter, and not in 5 years' time. So this is where you have the need to have a growth curve, but also a sustainable curve, a sustainability curve. And it's in that balance of those two that you will have a continuous development where you can produce the profits that you need to sustain the company today, to sustain all the operating expenses, the salaries and the raw materials or whatever. But that also gives you the ability to invest in the initiatives that will create the future business. So it's not only the business of today, but structure your activities and your decisions so that there will be business in the future. That's a core concept of the thinking processes of TOC, which I have fully embraced in TameFlow as well.
That's wonderful, Steve. I always believe in the concept of having the enabling constraints that actually drives the continuous improvement process in the organization. That's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, I think that's there we also have a terminology thing, because the word constraint is overloaded. If you look at Kinefing, for instance, they talk about enabling constraints and governing constraints. The word is the same, but the significance is not quite the same. And I think the constraints you are referring to are probably closer to the TOC kind of constraint, and maybe they could be seen as governing constraints. But it goes back to that consideration I said before. Unless you have friction, you will just slip, and you won't move forward. So you need to figure out where that friction is, so that you know where to exert the force. And it's even more important to be able to deliberately place the point of constraint where you want it, and to keep it there. There's nothing more disconcerting than having the wandering constraint syndrome. And that probably was a reason why David Anderson abandoned TOC and went over to Kanban, because the impression is that in knowledge work, the constraint is constantly moving around from one place to the next in a matter of hours, if not minutes. So if that is the case, you cannot apply the reasoning of TOC. You cannot find that fulcrum, that pivot around which you could exercise all this force, so to say, to move the organization forward. And therefore, I think it's really important to realize that even in knowledge work, it is possible to find this actual constraint. Now, I see lots of synergies with lean thinking. Now, especially if you use TOC to find where this very special magic point is, and then on that point or around that point, you deploy all the lean concepts. So if you're like building the flow of information, the notion of the and-on chord, it must be triggered somewhere, but it must be triggered in a very special way if it is on the constraint, because then you know you have no margins, you have no tolerance. You must really shut down operations to address that point. So it changes the nature um, of lean concepts by giving them even more focus and making them even um, more powerful. Even the notion of automation, of having like automation with the human touch, I think is essential. I use a lot of metrics in TameFlow to generate signals. So you basically have like a spreadsheet that crunches data and you get signals. But at that point, you need a thinking head and actually more thinking heads to analyze the situation. Um, and this streamlines the communication towards those who have to make the decision. So, escalation paths, the feedback loops get much tighter. Unfortunately, in the agile world, in recent years, I've seen like this trend that metrics are being despised because they are seen as a tool of, let's say, of oppression of the poor people on the floor, and the metrics are being abused by management. Of course, that does happen. Not every manager is enlightened, and you have good and bad people in all parts of life. But to jump to the conclusions that you shouldn't use metrics because they can be abused is one jump too much. So I use a lot of metrics in order to create the triggers, the work execution signals that then enable the right conversations, focused conversation, what is going on, with rapid escalation paths and rapid responses from the top when that is needed.
I think you made a point, Steve, about the metrics part. See, I personally believe that as such, metrics are, the numbers that gets created and people want to track it. It is not the numbers as such that are good or bad, but how the data is going to be used is the most important part of it. For example, velocity, which is the most popular method measure in the agile teams, can be used to say, right, we have these numbers in place, and how can we plan better? What can we learn from it? Is one way of thinking. Another way of thinking is your velocity for this sprint is less than the earlier sprint. What what is wrong with your team, and then beat them up to increase the velocity. But as such, the velocity is not the culprit as such there. The velocity is a metric. It just gave the number to anyone. And the people who own the metrics and how they use the metrics actually who make the difference. So, and fundamentally, I personally believe that no matter what metric that we create and we give it to people, they know how to use it or how to misuse it, no matter what how the metric says.
Yeah, you bring up another absolute key element of TameFlow. I mentioned a couple of times that it's based on patterns, but the other big element in TameFlow are mental models. So what you're stating here is that you can have exactly the same kind of metric in different companies, but depending on who is observing those metrics, you will have different interpretations because those people will have different mental models. So one aspect of TameFlow is to ensure that the whole organization, from the CEO to the junior hire, share the same mental models and therefore can interpret reality in the same way, so that there is no divergence of interpretation. And of course, this tends to build up the unity of purpose, as I mentioned before. So any of these technical numbers like velocity, throughput, cycle time, lead time, now all these numbers, they are quite meaningless if the different decision makers in the company have a different view of what they should convey. So the first thing to work on is to arrive at a common understanding of what these numbers are, and also not only to understand what they are and what they mean, but also what they imply in terms of the decisions that you should make. Oftentimes, a lot of operational improvement can be gained without changing the processes at all, but just by changing the decision points and the criteria for making a decision. For instance, the replenishment signals when you will add more work to the system. But that implies that anyone who is involved in that value chain has the same understanding. Kanban goes in that direction because it's very visual and it makes it very, very evident of what a replenishment signal is. In lack of visualization, the problem would be how do you create a common understanding that a replenishment signal should not like overload the system, but at the same time should be timely enough so that the delivery to the customer comes when expected. So mental models is something I work a lot with, and which I think is not so much covered in the other systems. You mentioned framework, and I have like this list of things that TameFlow is not. So TameFlow does not have reference processes like Lean or extreme programming. It does not have roles, artifacts, and events like Scrum. It does not have principles and values like Agile and the Kanban method. It does not have maturity levels like CMMI or KMMI, and it's not a framework like Scrum, Safe, or even less. So from that point of view, I think it stands out. It's quite different from most of these approaches, and the two like pillars, if you want to use those terms, are patterns and mental models, which gives a lot this plasticity, flexibility that I mentioned before. So I am sure, and I would like to explore with how these ideas can be sprinkled on top of LeSS, for instance, to make an even better variation of LeSS. In my experience, I've used TameFlow in all sorts of settings and teams, even those that were like champions in their respective arts, like Scrum or Kanban. And even so, with the sprinkle of the spice of TameFlow, things improved considerably. So,
sure, I think it's quite possible. I think the wonderful the wonderful benefit of a plasticity is its ability to mix and match with other ideas and other frameworks and other practices. I think that's definitely scope for exploration there. As I said before, LeSS is a product development framework, so it doesn't touch anything beyond the product development. It is not designed for designing an organization. Where does HR sit? Where is finance sit, and what kind of hierarchy? The organizational design is not something part of LeSS, but LeSS focuses and powerful when it comes to the development of a product, because LeSS is based on Scrum. So if there are other ideas, and especially from TameFlow, that can be used beyond the product development to help the organization at the organizational level, and that will be beneficial as well. And already you have been mentioning Kanban, theory of constraints, and the lean and the flow of ideas. And lean thinking and systems thinking are the two out of the 10 principles that LeSS actually recommends people to explore, because LeSS clearly says that when we are dealing with complex product development environments, there is no best practice. No one can give the best practice there. So people need to make decision depending on what works for them. And that's where it brings 10 principles into picture, and some of the principles include queuing theory, the lean thinking and systems thinking. And I could see that from conversation with you, Steve, the concept of mental models, the concept of flow, the concept of theory of constraints, and many of these ideas are part of set of principles. I'm talking from my angle, my view of the world, where people can learn and introduce those ideas into the product development frameworks.
Yeah, there are many schools of thoughts and mental models that come together. And with TameFlow, we have a few peculiarities. For instance, we have a strong emphasis on the financial results, because most companies are there to make money. So if you're not making money, the company will close and your job will disappear. It's so simple. So one priority has always been, how can we show to management that the decisions they make at their level and the operational decisions that others make further down in the organization are really contributing to the bottom line. And this is where you get into throughput accounting rather than cost accounting, and that opens up a whole area. And by the way, since I'm mentioning this this evening, and I'm telling the audience at 8 o'clock Central European Time, I think it was. Maybe we'll double check that. But Daniel, my co-author, Daniel Dwaron, will have a webinar together with John Coleman, and the topic will be exactly the topic of throughput accounting. So that's one thing, throughput accounting. Then we also have the focus on psychological flow, both at the individual and at the team level. So one thing I do, which I think is quite unique, is trying to connect the feedback of the metrics to be able to calibrate the load of work in order to keep the team in the psychological flow state. This is something I have not seen other schools of thought doing. Metrics are very clinical, very cold. They are there to produce the numbers and maybe sustain finance, but they are not used as a tool to help the team find and maintain psychological flow states. And then we have this whole notion of finding the constraint. As far as I can tell, there is no method out there. You mentioned queuing theory, and that's clearly part of the solution of finding the constraint, or it's part of the mental model to find the constraint. You need to manage queues. But then situation might be much more complex. LeSS, you mentioned, is a product development framework. And of course, nowadays, many companies are very much product focused. So I think LeSS can cover a very huge slice of the market. But there are other companies that are what I call the PEST environment. Some people don't like the acronym, but it renders the difficulty of the ideas, where you have multiple projects or products, and you have multiple stakeholders, you have multiple teams, and multiple events or deadlines. So when you have this huge mess of many people wanting many things at different times, and you have plenty of resources, many resources, which, notwithstanding being plenty, are always overloaded nonetheless. Well, that's a situation where, if you're able to find the constraint, then you are enabling the thinking of Goldratt with inherent simplicity. You find that leverage point that even if you have this pest environment, you will be able to manage that. And that's something I know I have experienced and done, but it requires it needs that fundamental element to be able to identify the constraint in that kind of situation.
Yeah, no, this is spot on. The problem in the organization is, um, see, there are two ways I look at it. One is consciously um, create constraints um, to achieve certain set of objectives. For example, in case of Toyota, the constraint of related to people not available to buy to mass produce um, vehicles just because Ford was doing it, but Japan was not in that state to really mass produce and keep the inventories and stuff like that. So there was already a constraint that was created by the system, and that in turn enabled Taichi Ono and the leadership of the company uh, to impose certain constraints that are context specific to Toyota. The environment constraints enabled the individual entities within the system to create their own constraints. That's one way wherein we need to have leaders who can think and create constraints to achieve goals. And of course, in order to do that, one needs to understand the leverage points as well. Without understanding the leverage points, we really don't know how this is going to react. The second part is um, if there is already an existing constraint, how do we utilize and learn more about the constraint so that either we can change it or we can use the constraints for our own benefit to achieve the goal. But nowadays in the organization, I don't know, I want to learn from you, or hear from you, from your experience, that do we have the organizations at the moment? We are not in the same era as Japan. In the case of Japan, the World War, it created a constraints where the economy was in doldrums. But nowadays, in the how I'm seeing the industry is that there is no dearth for money. There is a whole lot of money. The organization actually literally don't have to worry. I have seen multi-billion dollars of money being spent and wasted without thinking of anything. So people are not worried too much about the constraints of money at the moment. Um, but at the same time, if the continuous improvement, the innovation needs to happen in the organization, they needs to create the constraints. Have you come across the organizations and the leaders where they consciously look at creating constraints to achieve their objectives?
So I think here we really need to first clarify like terminology, because when you're using the word constraint in the context that you described, it's not the same thing as the constraint of Goldratt and the theory constraint. So I don't know how to resolve like this mismatch of terminology, but maybe I could suggest that what you are talking about are limiting factors that might be contextual, given the situation, like in Japan post-World War, no resources and lacking everything, or might be designed, as you said, put the limiting factor in, and one first exercise in this direction is simply when you're thinking about offering a product, what is the target segment? You can produce something, you can mass produce it for everyone, but if you decide to focus on a niche market or a segment of the market, you are setting up a limiting factor. But in that limitation, you might find force, because in that limited market, maybe you can stress features of your product or service offering that would not be interesting for the other segments, but that give you a decisive competitive edge in that segment. So that is one example of deliberately putting in place a limiting factor. But we can find many. Even in operations or in finance. The infamous budgeting process, which I am resisting very much, but it's that kind of nature. You are you are limited by the amount of financial resources, and these have to sustain various initiatives. So you have the budgeting process, and that is an exercise in setting up these limitations. So I think what you're saying is really relevant. Now, from the TOC perspective, I think we fall into talking about TOC because Lean and TOC are like cousins, if not brothers. So in an example you do, I can relate to TOC, even though I'd like to remind that TameFlow is really patterns and mental models, so it could be broader. But in this case, in your point of are companies aware of the constraint that they have? Most companies are not. They are not. So that's why those few that realize that get like the understanding of this enormous leverage point. Now, we are all familiar with the Pareto principle, 80-20. Theory of constraints is Pareto on steroids. It's not 80-20, it's 199, or actually 0.001 and 99999. So it's getting very much out of a tiny effort. Companies are not aware of this. That's why those that have the insight to adopt these mental models can gain huge profits and market shares. But there is one constraint that all companies have nonetheless, and especially the larger they are, the more this is relevant. And it might be debatable, but from my perspective, it's a common thing, and it's the constraint of management attention. Management attention is always overloaded. The larger the company is, the more things to handle. Of course, the company grows, they delegate, they put in layers and layers and layers of management, but that has the counter effect that they are no longer in control because everything gets filtered, and by the when it reaches the top, it's nice, sweet, and beautiful. Only the disasters eventually come up, but there is too much lack of transparency because of this. So if you can address management attention, I think you are helping the companies a lot. And with TameFlow, we do that with this notion of working on the flow of information. So the flow of operations is like horizontal, it's the value stream, the value network. But the flow of information is the nervous system that goes from the ends, from the hands and the fingers to the brains that makes decisions. And there you can operate on the speed and quality of information that moves around, but especially, and here we come to the connection to what you were saying, the limitation. So you need to limit the amount of information that goes to the top. Why? Because the top is overloaded. That's why things like metrics with work execution signals that trigger that are a triggering point for an event that needs attention are so powerful, because then you know that the attention is really needed. In normal companies, the CEOs are drowning in noise. There is no signal. Everything is noise. Everyone is shouting for. Everyone is in panic. They need top management's attention to make critical decisions when the decisions are not critical at all. So if you can filter down all that noise and let the important elements stand out, and only those important elements reach the top, you are offloading the backpack, so to say, of information that the C-level has to bear, and therefore the quality of decision-making becomes much better, and of course even the speed of decision-making is affected. It's curious that Scrum and Agile has adopted the cadence, the notion of a cadence. And I think that is just a reflection of how top management works. They work in quarters, and then that's broken down in months and weeks. So there is this notion of a cadence. And in reality, the cadence is just one way to manage the overload of information. So if you're taking away the overload of information, the need of the cadence is less. And what was maybe before scheduled at a certain interval, say, every 2 weeks you have a steering committee meeting, you could get away with that cadence altogether and have signals when the steering committee meeting is needed. So it could be needed every day if you are in a situation of emergency, or you could do one now and one in 3 months if everything is under control and the signals are not detecting any anomaly. So it's like this combination of finding out what are the limiting factors, and where you detect that there is overload or potential of overload, there you do exactly what you are saying. There you have reason to put in a limiting factor, because if you don't do that, your constraint will be overloaded even more. But I'm going off a tangent here.
You're right. I think, see, in my view of the world, of course, my constraint of the mental model, the constraint is a bit different from yours. But from the cadence and the whether it's 1 day or 2 weeks or 1 month, all these kind of conversation actually triggered different parts of my brain. One, of course, one for me from the constraint, from my view of the world, for me the having that 2 weeks cadence is a constraint, is a way of introducing some kind of a constraint in the system. We need to have some constraint to measure towards, whether it is the time, whether it is the money, whether it is whatever it is a constraint. So I think you're right. Scrum, kind of other agile methods took the path of putting the time as a constraint, time boxed constraints. One thing. Second thing is whether it's 2 weeks, 1 week, whether it should be 1 month. That kind of a cadence, I think it triggered the conversation with queuing theory in my mind. About the batch sizes and the transaction costs and the holding costs and so on and so forth. Do you bring any of these concepts as well in TameFlow? While discussing about, because of course, as you mentioned earlier, you don't have these specific practices or anything there. But would you be recommending any of these ideas for them to make specific decisions, keeping the queuing theory?
Yeah, I mean, there are many, let's call them practices, which are typical of TameFlow. I don't like to qualify them as practices. I like to qualify them as praxis derived from the mental model. So theory-informed practice, which also gives us the ulterior degree of freedom that if we discover something new, if our mental models evolve and we learn something new, we are very quick on changing the practice part. So the practice is never cast in stone, but it's always considered as something that can always evolve and improve. But I'll give you a few examples of constraints in the sense that you intended, so limiting factor in my vocabulary, which are derived from the mental models. One is the notion of having a target scope, so not the time box, the sprint, so to say, but a target scope of work, which I call the MOVE, the minimum outcome value effort, and this goes back to the notion of the like MMRs, MBIs. The key element is that this is connected to a financial metrics. So the MOVE is something that has to have a financial return. If you do anything less, you cannot sell it because it's not complete. If you're doing anything more, you're doing too much, so it's waste in lean terms. So you have to find that exact balance of scope where there is a business value that can be quantified, so quantification becomes an element. And finding that balance is putting in that limiting factor on the scope of work that you want to do. Another example of limiting factor is, okay, you decided to do this work, now it has to go through the system, but we all know that we cannot overload the system. Scrum, you're using the time box and velocity to determine the next load for the next sprint, so that you don't overload the people working there. In TameFlow, we are using the drum buffer rope element of theory of constraints. So we are releasing work into the workflow only at the pace that the constraint is able to sustain. And this has monumental consequences, especially for the cost accountants, because if you just look at the story of Herbie, you know that anyone else except Herbie has to perform at less of their capacity. So you're limiting their capacity. From a cost accounting perspective, this is worse than swearing in a church, because you are saying that some people have literally to sit still and wait and not work. So deliberately not working, which is a very hard thing to accept in the normal situation of cost-driven companies. I keep on saying that a high-performing organization is one where people are waiting for work and not work waiting for people. So there I gave you 2, maybe 3 examples of limiting factors that are derived from mental models and that are turned into actual practices. But I stress what I said before. TameFlow is not about the praxis. It's about the mental model that then, through your elaboration and your decision-making, turns into a practice. And the outcome of exercising that practice can give you more information that feedbacks into the mental models and might change your understanding. So you have this praxis loop, theory-informed practice.
Right. I think thanks, Steve. I think that was a wonderful way of explaining, and of course, the use of the drum buffer rope. All these things reminds me of the book that I was reading with the goal several years ago. The key thing for me, in this conversation about the mental model is that in a very complex environment, um, trying to view the world and then trying to ascertain what the world means to me is more like the analogy is like elephant and the 7 blind men. The 7 blind men, each one of them will look at the elephant like a rope or a snake or a pillar, so on and so forth. And there's a reality because we can't perceive um, what my mental model is until and unless I'm able to express it. And a couple of years ago, I was trying to research to find out is there a way to depict the mental model so that the other people can see. And of course, from systems thinking perspective, it provides tools like systems modeling, or also called as a causal loop modeling, behavior and time pattern, so on and so forth, to expose as much mental model as possible, so that visually everyone can see what I'm thinking. But still, I say that systems modeling, there is no right or wrong about it because it all depends on what I know about the car, what I know about the employees there. So how have you introduced, because systems modeling is extremely a thoughtful concept, but at the same time very elusive, and trying to bottle and create a complex environment and then trying to align everyone to the same mental model is extremely hard. So do you recommend any tools or ideas to ensure that the mental models in a complex organization is aligned?
Well, as a matter of fact, now the latest book, the Tame Your Workflow, which I wrote with Daniel Dvaron. And by the way, now that you give me the reminder, sorry, that's the wrong banner. this one, this is where people can find the book. I want to mention the book because it is very, very visual. Of course, no, mental models are abstract, so you need a way to visualize them. Now, the book here is also very much focused on the operational flow. There are very few elements. Now, we go into throughput accounting as well. There are elements of informational flow, but the focus is primarily on operational flow. So, how do you go about to visualize mental models in an organization? Well, there are many approaches. One is taught by the theory of constraints with the thinking processes. So it's more based on logic rather than systems diagrams. And the good thing about that approach is that you can engage the people inside the organization because they can recognize the so-called UDEs, the undesirable effects. As a matter of fact, they will state them. They will bring them out. It's a way to get people to express the negative elements that are present in the organization, and then through logic arrive at transformations that will bring to a future state. They might not be the best way to represent a system, but the power is that they are accessible. So mental models do not only need to be good representations of some aspect of reality, but they need to be accessible. For the reason I stated at the beginning, that these mental models have to be shared across the organization from top to bottom, so that you would not be able to use a complicated depiction of system that you would need like a degree in electrical engineering to be able to understand the diagrams. It might work for you. It might give you a very deep technical understanding, but it's losing the praxis, the pragmatic component. The mental models, in fact, that I use a lot at the end are translated into narratives, stories, metaphors. I always tell the story of Herbie, the Boy Scout. I have the story of the patient in the hospital. I have the story of the jungle, the jeep, and the journey. The story of the McDonald's tray serving a meal. These stories encapsulate many facets of mental models, but being stories, they can be told and retold. In fact, when I go in an organization after 3 weeks, I think even the walls know about the story of Herbie because I keep on telling it over and over again. It's like, do you know where the constraint is? Have you thought about the constraints? What happened during the story of Herbie? Are you applying the same questions? Are you looking for the constraint? So everything is reduced to something that can be communicated and understood by all and everyone. Now, of course, if you go back to the design board and you start looking at patterns and pattern languages and pattern theory, well, there you have network models of patterns which can become very, very convoluted and can capture many facets and aspects of reality. But that would be like the more technical level where you're looking at existing systems, you decompose them, you figure out which are the good parts, and you try to recompose them into something that is better. That is how TameFlow has evolved in the theoretical aspects. But then in the praxis, we need to have stories that are representatives of powerful mental models. And we're running out of time. We're actually beyond time. You mentioned the 7 blind men having many opinions, but I think with the internet, we have 7 billion blind people having all sorts of opinions of what is going on in the world. Venky, thank you so much for being here. We're out of time. I didn't realize, when we have fun, we talk a lot, both me and you. But thank you so much. Are there any closing words you would like to tell the audience?
I think this is a wonderful place, Steve. I think both you and I, we have something common is about the past, history, the learning ability, and I think we need to keep expanding our knowledge and horizon. There is no end to it, um, um, and I'm glad that you have such a wonderful community. And I think all of us we need to keep learning. There's never end to it, and I learned quite a bit in this conversation. I made a lot of notes as well. I need to get back and do some more homework there.
Okay, so just remind the audience you can get in touch with Venky on LinkedIn with his handle Systems Thinker. You also find Venky on Twitter at Venky_NK, and you might take a look at his website empirical.coach. Thank you very much, Venky, and to all friends of Herbie, see you again around the next Campfire Talk. Goodbye.
Thank you all.